Shakespeare, The World as Stage. I'm going to begin reading in chapter 2, The Early Years, and, well, I'll start and then change. William Shakespeare was born into a world that was short of people and struggled to keep those it had. In 1564, England had a population of between 3 million and 5 million, much less than 300 years earlier when the plague began to take continuous heavy toll. Now the number of living Britons was actually in retreat. The previous decade had seen a fall in population nationally of about 6%. In London, as many as a quarter of the citizenry may have perished. And then I'm going to skip about 6 pages because it talks about the plague and the illnesses and the dangerous treatments, as well as Queen Elizabeth's free use of punishment for both criminals and those who were displeasing to her. There were restrictive laws concerning what one could wear, what they could eat, when they could eat. It affected the lives of all 16th century Britons. So we're going to hop over and nearly every aspect of life was subject to some measure of legal restraint. At a local level, you could be fined for letting your ducks wander in the road, for misappropriating town gravel, for having a guest in your house without a permit from the local bailiff. Our very first encounter with the name Shakespeare is in relation to one such general transgression in 1552, 12 years before William was born, when his father, John, was fined 1 shilling for keeping a dung heap in Henley Street in Stratford. This was a matter not just for civic fussiness, but of real concern because the town's repeated plague outbreaks were affected. A fine of 1 shilling was a painful penalty, probably equivalent to 2 days' earnings for Shakespeare. Not much is known about John Shakespeare's early years. He was born about 1530 and grew up on a farm at nearby Snitterfield, but came to Stratford as a young man, sparing posterity having to think of his son as the Bard of Snitterfield. And John Shakespeare became a glover and a widower, someone who works white or soft leather. It was an eminently respectable trade. Stratford was a reasonably consequential town. With a population of roughly 2,000 at a time when only 3 cities in Britain had 10,000 inhabitants or more, it stood about 85 miles northwest of London, a 4-day walk or a 2-day horseback ride, on one of the main wool-pack routes between the capital and Wales. Travel for nearly everyone was on foot or by horseback or not at all. Coaches as a means of public transport were invented in the year of Shakespeare's birth, but weren't generally used by the masses until the following century. Shakespeare's father is often said, particularly by those who wish to portray William Shakespeare as too deprived of stimulus and education to have written the plays attributed to him, to have been illiterate. Illiteracy was the usual condition in 16th century England, to be sure. According to one estimate, at least 70% of men and 90% of women of the period couldn't even sign their names. But as one moved up the social scale, literacy rates rose appreciably. Among skilled craftsmen, a category that included John Shakespeare, some 60% could read, a clearly respectable proportion. The conclusion of illiteracy with regard to Shakespeare's father is based on the knowledge that he signed his surviving papers with a mark. But lots of Elizabethans, particularly those who like to think of themselves as busy men, did likewise even when they could read, rather as busy executives might today scribble their initials in the margins of a memo. As Samuel Schoenbaum points out, Adrian Quinney, a Stratford contemporary of the Shakespeares, signed all his known Stratford documents with a cross and would be certainly considered illiterate, except that we also happen to have an eloquent letter in his own hand written to William Shakespeare in 1598. It is worth bearing in mind that John Shakespeare rose through a series of positions of authority in which an inability to read would have been tiresome, if not insuperable, handicap. Anyway, as should be obvious, his ability to write or not could have had absolutely no bearing on the capabilities of his children. I think he digresses. Literate or not, John was a popular and respected fellow. In 1556, he took up the first of many municipal positions when he was elected borough ale taster. The job required him to make sure that measures and prices were correctly observed throughout the town, not only by innkeepers, but also by butchers and bakers. 2 years later, he became a constable, a position that then, as now, argued for some physical strength and courage. And the next year became an affurer, someone who assesses fines for matters not handled by existing statutes. Then he became successively burgess, chamberlain, and alderman, which last entitled him to be addressed as master rather than simply as goodman. Finally, in 1568, he was placed in the highest elective office in town, High Bailiff, mayor in all but name. So William Shakespeare was born into a household of quite a lot of importance locally. One of John's duties as High Bailiff was to approve payment from town funds for performances by visiting troupes of actors. Stratford, in the 1570s, became a regular stop for touring players, and it is reasonable to suppose that an impressionable young Will saw many plays as he grew up and possibly received some encouragement or made some contact that smoothed his entrance into the London theatre later. He would at the very least have seen actors with whom he would eventually become closely associated. For 400 years, this was about all that was known of John Shakespeare, but in the 1980s, some discoveries at the Public Record Office showed that there was another, rather more dubious side to his character. It appears that he hung out with some fairly shady fellows, says David Thomas. 4 times in the 1570s, John was prosecuted or threatened with prosecution. The records are sometimes a touch unclear, for trading in wool and for money lending, both highly illegal activities. Usury, in particular, was considered a vice most odious and detestable in the stark phrasing of the law, and fines could be severe, but John seems to have engaged in it at a seriously committed level. In 1570, he was accused of making loans worth £220, including interest, to a Walter Mussum. This was a very considerable sum, well over £100,000 in today's money, and Mussum appears not to have been a good risk. At his death, his entire estate was worth only £114, much less than John Shakespeare had lent him. The risk attached to such an undertaking was really quite breathtaking. Anyone found guilty of it would forfeit all the money lent, plus interest, and face a stiff fine and the possibility of imprisonment. The law applied, a little unfairly it must be said, to any extension of credit. If someone took delivery of, say, wool from you with the understanding that he would repay you later with a little interest for your trouble, that was considered usury too. It was this form of usury which John Shakespeare was probably guilty, for he also traded, or so it would seem, in large quantities of wool. In 1571, for instance, he was accused of acquiring 300 tods, which is 8,400 pounds, of wool. That's a lot of wool and a lot of risk. We cannot be certain how guilty he was. Informers, as David Thomas points out, sometimes brought actions as a kind of nuisance ploy, hoping that the accused, even if innocent, would agree to an out-of-court settlement rather than face a costly and protracted trial in London. And one of John Shakespeare's accusers did have a record of bringing such malicious suits. In any case, something severely unfavorable seems to have happened to John's business life, for in 1576, when William was 12, he abruptly withdrew from public affairs and stopped attending meetings. He was listed at one point among 9 Stratford residents who were thought to have missed church services for fear of process for debt. His colleagues repeatedly reduced or excused levies that he was due to pay. They also kept his name on the membership for another 10 years in the evident hope that he could make a recovery. He never did. Shakespeare's mother, I know you're wondering when I'd get to her, Mary Arden, provides us with a history that is rather more straightforward, if not tremendously vivid or enlightening. She came from a minor branch of a prominent family. Her father farmed, and the family was comfortable, but probably no more than that. She was the mother of 8 children, 4 daughters, of whom only one lived to adulthood, and 4 sons, all of whom reached their majority, but only one of whom, Will, married. Not a great deal is known about any of them apart from Will. Joan, born in 1558, married a local hatter named Hart and lived to be 77. Gilbert, born in 1566, became a successful haberdasher. Richard was born in 1574 and lived to be not quite 40, and that is all we know about him. Edmund, the youngest, became an actor in London. How successfully and with which companies are unknown, and he died there at the age of 27. He is buried in Southwark Cathedral, the only one of the 8 siblings not to rest at Holy Trinity in Stratford. 7 of the 8 Shakespeare children appear to have been named after close relations or family friends. The exception was William, the inspiration whose name has always been a small mystery, like nearly everything else about his life. It is commonly supposed, and frequently written, that Shakespeare enjoyed a good education at the local grammar school, King's New School, situated in the Guildhall in Church Street, and he probably did, though in fact we don't know, as the school records for the period were lost long ago. What is known is that the school was open to any local boy, however dim or deficient, so long as he could read and write, and William Shakespeare patently could do both. King's was of an unusually high standard and was generously supported by the town. The headmaster enjoyed an annual salary of £20, roughly twice what was paid in other towns, and even more, as is often noted, than the headmaster at Eton got at the time. The 3 masters at the school in Shakespeare's day were all Oxford men, again a distinction. Boys normally attended the school for 7 or 8 years, beginning at the age of 7. The school day was long and characterized by an extreme devotion to tedium. Pupils sat on hard wooden benches from 6 in the morning to 5 or 6 in the evening, with only 2 short pauses for refreshment. 6 days a week. The 7th day was probably given over largely to religious instruction. For much of the year, they can hardly have seen daylight. It is easy to understand the line in As You Like It about a boy, quote, creeping like snail unwillingly to school. Discipline was probably strict. A standard part of a teacher's training was how to give a flogging. Yet compared with many private or boarding schools, Stratford's grammar provided a cushioned existence. Boys at Westminster School in London had to sleep in a windowless grain storeroom, bereft of heat, and endure icy washes, meager food, and frequent whippings. But then, these were conditions not unknown to many 20th century English schoolboys. Their school day began at dawn, as well as also incorporated an additional hour of lessons in the evening and private studies that kept some boys up late into the night. Far from having small Latin and less Greek, as Ben Jonson famously charged, Shakespeare had a great deal of Latin, for the life of a grammar schoolboy was spent almost entirely in reading, writing, and reciting Latin, often in the most mind-numbing, repetitious manner. One of the principal texts of the day taught pupils 150 different ways of saying, "Thank you for your letter," in Latin. Through such exercises, Shakespeare would have learned every possible rhetorical device and ploy, metaphor and anaphor, epistrophe, hyperbole, synecdoche, epanelepsis, and other equally arcane and taxing to memorize. And I had to look up a couple of those, so I'll share that with you. Synecdoche is when part of a sentence represents the whole. And an example of that would be instead of saying soldiers, you might call them boots. Or instead of saying businessmen, you might call them suits. The epanelepsis is the same word at the beginning and end of a sentence with intervening words. An example of that is, "The king is dead, long live the king." Very important for grammar students. According to Stanley Wells and Gary Taylor, in their introduction to the Oxford edition of the Complete Works, any grammar school pupil of the day would have received a more thorough grounding in Latin, rhetoric, and literature than most present-day holders of a university degree in classics. But they wouldn't have received much else. Whatever mathematics, history, or geography Shakespeare knew, he almost certainly didn't learn it at grammar school. Formal education stopped for Shakespeare probably when he was about 15. What became of him immediately after that is unknown, though many legends have rushed to fill the vacuum. A particularly durable one is that he was caught poaching deer from the estate of Sir Thomas Lucy at Charlecot, just outside Stratford, and prudently elected to leave town in a hurry. The story and its attendant details are often repeated as fact even now. Roy Strong, in the scholarly Tudor and Jacobean Portraits, states that Shakespeare left Stratford in 1585 to avoid prosecution for poaching at Charlecot, and that he was to be found in London the following year. In fact, we don't know when he left Stratford or arrived in London, or whether he ever poached so much as an egg. It is, in any case, unlikely that he poached deer from Charlecot, as it didn't have a deer park until the following century. The only certainty we possess for the early period of Shakespeare's adulthood is that in late November 1582, a clerk at Worcester recorded that William Shakespeare had applied for a license to marry. The bride, according to the ledger, was not Anne Hathaway, but Anne Whatley of nearby Temple Grafton, a mystery that has led some biographers to suggest that Shakespeare courted two women to the point of matrimony at the same time, and that he stood up Anne Whatley out of duty to a pregnant Anne Hathaway. Anthony Burgess, in a slightly fevered moment, suggested that young Will, sent on a skin-buying errands to Temple Grafton, perhaps fell for a comely daughter, sweet as Mabe and shy as a fawn. In fact, Anne Whatley probably never existed. In 400 years of searching, no other record of her has ever been found. The clerk at Worcester was not, it appears, the most meticulous of record keepers. Elsewhere in the ledgers in the same hand, scholars have found Barbar recorded as Baker, Edgecock confused with Elcock, and Darby put in place of Bradley. So turning Hathaway into Whatley was by no means beyond his wayward capabilities. Moreover, for Shakespeare, investigators really are tireless. The records also show that in another book on the same day, the clerk noted a suit concerning a William Whatley, and it is presumed that the name somehow stuck in his mind. No one, however, has yet found a convincing explanation for how Temple Grafton came into the records when the real bride was from Shottery. The marriage license itself is lost, but a separate document, the marriage bond, survives. On it, Anne Hathaway is correctly identified. Shakespeare's name is rendered as Shagspeare, the first of many arrestingly variable renderings. The marriage bond cost £40 and permitted the marriage to proceed with one reading of the bonds instead of the normal 3, so that it might be conducted sooner. The £40 was to indemnify the church authorities against any costly suits arising from the action, a claim of breach of promise, for instance. It's a truly whopping sum, something like £20,000 in today's money, particularly when one's father is so indebted that he can barely leave his own house for fear of arrest and imprisonment. Clearly, there was much urgency to get the couple wed. What makes this slightly puzzling is that it was not unusual for a bride to be pregnant on her wedding day. Up to 40% of brides were in that state, according to one calculation, so why the extravagant haste here is a matter that can only be guessed at. It was unusual, however, for a young man to be married at 18, as Shakespeare was. Men tended to marry in their mid to late 20s, women a little sooner. But these figures were extremely variable. Christopher Marlowe had a sister who married at 12 and died at 13 in childbirth. Until 1604, the age of consent was 12 for a girl and 14 for a boy. We know precious little about Shakespeare's wife and nothing at all about her temperament, intelligence, religious views, or other personal qualities. We are not even sure that Anne was her usual name. In her father's will, she was referred to as Agnes, which at the time was pronounced with a silent G, making it Anus. Agnes and Anne were often treated interchangeably. We also know she was one of 7 children and that she evidently came from a prosperous stock. Though her childhood home was always referred to as Anne Hathaway's cottage, it was, and is, a handsome and substantial property containing 12 rooms. Her gravestone describes her as being 67 years old at the time of her death in 1623. It is from this alone that we conclude that she was considerably older than her husband. Apart from the gravestone, there's no evidence of her age on record. We know that she had 3 children with William Shakespeare: Susanna in May 1583, and the twins Judith and Hamnet in early February 1585. But all the rest is darkness. We know nothing about the couple's relationship, whether they bickered constantly or were eternally doting. We don't know if she ever accompanied him to London, saw any of his plays, or even took an interest in them. We have no indication of any warmth between them, but then we have no indication of warmth between William Shakespeare and any other human being. It is tempting to suppose that they had some sort of real bond for at least the first years of their marriage. They had children together, after all. But it may actually be, for all we know, that they were very loving indeed and enjoyed a continuing, if presumably often long-distance, affection throughout their marriage. 2 of the few certainties of Shakespeare's life are that his marriage lasted till his death and that he sent much of his wealth back to Stratford as soon as he was able, which may not be conclusive proof of attachment, but hardly argues against it. And I think I'm out of time. And so this might be a good place to stop. So now you guys know more about what happened with Will when he was growing up that probably has absolutely no effect on anything he wrote. And that's the end.